Um, there is a note-taking form I'm going to put into the chat that you can use just as we go along. I'm going to ask you to reflect every once in a while, and you can put your notes in this form. You will not be sharing that with me in any way. So please, be as honest and open in that form. It's just for your records, or don't use it. It's up to you completely. It's just trying to help you get your thoughts centered around what we're going to talk about. So today's presentation is about presuming competence. And we will be talking about things that may challenge the way you think. And so please feel free to give pushback, to ask questions. A lot of the information I'm getting today is from this booklet. It's More Than Just Being In, about inclusion. And I will tell you, my name is Lori Hersick. I am the staff developer here at the IU. I've been with the IU for 23 years. I started out for the first 12 years teaching emotional support classes under the old Larry Bresnahan when he was around, Dr. B. And then I moved into where I was a transition consultant with the IU, helping students transition from high school into work, college, and those types of things. So I worked with a lot of our secondary level classes across Adams and Franklin County mostly. And now I work as an inclusive staff developer. So a lot of what I do is around inclusion. And again, if you're not muted, if you want to make sure that you are. So agreements, just making sure that while we're in here, engagement is my priority. So like I said, we're going to use that reflective sheet so that you can give feedback and ideas, and that you can just write your thoughts down. It looks different from everyone. So please, whatever you feel comfortable with, whether you want to have your camera on or off, unless your supervisor has told you differently, I'm completely fine anyway. I'm happy if you unmute and talk to me, if you put something in the chat, however you want to do that. We want to honor all perspectives, making sure that we hear from everybody and know that, anything that's said is from the just assuming good intentions, that we are not here to judge, or we're just starting a conversation. The objectives today. When you leave this session, I hope that you've had time to consider your own assumptions about intelligence and about how kids learn. I want you to have a definition for presumed competence, so that if somebody came up to you and asked you what it is, you would at least have some understanding and be able to share that with them. And then to provide some basic steps to essentializing content for students, and that's their academic content. So we're going to do a real quick waterfall activity. We're famous for doing these, so you may have done them before, but what will happen is in your chat, I want you to type an answer to this, but don't hit enter until I tell you. And right now, today, with the weather being what it is, if there was no worry of COVID, no expense worries, and you could be anywhere in the world today, where would you be? So I'll give you a second to type that in the chat. And then when I tell you, we'll hit enter. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go ahead. Oh, a lot of beach people. I'm the same way. Oh, camp in the Adirondacks, good. Okay. Somebody say on their honeymoon. Oh my goodness. So a lot of on a honeymoon that you couldn't take. Oh, I'm so sorry if that's because of COVID. I know that just stinks. So you know what? Do what I did when I got married and take that five-year honeymoon. After you get married, you're married for 5 years, and take that honeymoon later once you're together for a while. It'll be just as much fun, I promise. In fact, you may be getting away from kids at the time, so it may be great. So, all right, a lot of beachy people. What I want to do is show you a real quick video of, this is from Project Max, which if you have not heard that is a program that is training run by Patty Wysocki and Kelly DeWeese. And Project Max was started years ago through the state. It provided funding for teachers who worked with students with more complex needs and trained the teachers how to take academic skills and essentialize them so that any level student could really participate in those academic standards and academic curricular. So I just want to show this real quick. I want to make sure that I'm sharing my sound, and we're not going to watch the whole thing, but this actually is LIU staff who have gone through this process. And I just wanted you to hear their voices to know this isn't something I'm talking about out in some district somewhere, anything like that. This is our own IU internal staff talking about this.
Zane, when Miss Lisa started using Project Max, did you start learning more high school things?
Yes.
The thing that struck a chord from the very first that I've heard this was the presumed competence. I've often been able to presume competence in functional skills, but I haven't been able to bring that over to the academic side. So if I presume competence that they are still learning their functional skills, I can certainly presume that they are competent enough to learn academic learning as well.
It's challenging them to be better thinkers. For literature, for example, we've done classic novels adapted to their level, and they've just really enjoyed that. So if they're enjoying learning, that's what's important.
I'd say the technology that we've learned and how we could use it in everyday life, because that is something that typical students use every day in their lives. I mean, my 10-year-old has a Chromebook at his school that he uses every day, so that they get to see iPads, a projector, get to use the Flickrs app and just be a part of a normal, typical classroom. I'm blown away by what they can do, and I'm blown away by the fact that I never even thought to have them do this. Like, I love that this is something new and exciting that they get to do, and that they're introduced to new topics.
This year I get to go to a workshop I didn't get to last year, so I get to go to other classes, and we're making a table, and it's awesome.
This year I got to go to Miss Everhart's class and meet new friends like Jada, Jenna, and Trinity, and Anna, and Dominic, and Austin.
This year my class is sending coffee to the teachers at my high school. We also go to the elementary school to sell coffee.
Do you like school more?
Yes.
Did you like doing the stories and reading?
Yes.
It includes him into like a quote-unquote regular world, what his other peers at a regular high school would be doing. Regular subjects, math, science, English. He's happy. He feels like he's more involved in the world. And I love to see when he's happy like that.
Okay, so again, that was our own staff right here at the LIU who have gone through that Project Max training, and they're starting to see what their students were capable of when it came to academics and some of those higher level thinking skills. So I want you to think about, what are your current assumptions? And I'm so sorry, these taskbars are like just everywhere here. But what are your current assumptions about intelligence? And so we're going to talk about different areas. And again, that comes from this book. We're going to look at 4 different assumptions. So what are your thoughts? And take a second to write in that note-taking sheet that I gave you. Can an individual's intelligence be reliably and accurately measured in order for us to predict their ability to learn? So think about that for a second. We use a lot of testing to find out where students are at. Can we reliably predict how well a student can do moving forward from that test? This takes us to a flawed assumption. There are 4 of them that are going to come out of this book and we're going to talk about. But intelligence, the flawed assumption is that intelligence is something that can be reliably measured. Really, a lot of our science today says that's absolutely not true. And what we're going to look at here is the history of IQ testing. We know that IQ testing, we now use the Stanford-Binet test. Well, in the early 1900s, Alfred Binet developed a series of tests to identify what students struggle with learning so that they could get specialized assistance in that area. But when we study him, we also know in 1909, he wrote in an article cautioning against the overuse of the test as a single measure for looking at what someone is capable of. He saw the direction that other scientists and therapists were going with this testing, and that was not his intention at all when he wrote what would later become what we have considered our IQ tests. But in the 1920s, the US decided that we were going to use an intelligence quotient or IQ test and use those scores to qualify students for different services. So we now have an educational system set on a standard of an IQ score, meaning a certain level of service, and someone not meeting that score, not getting that service, all on a flawed test that even the person who wrote the test said it was flawed for that use. So we have to really think about that. And our whole education system since the 1920s and even into our adult systems, because like I said, I worked in secondary transition. And if a student doesn't have an IQ of 70 or below, they don't receive the financial supports for day programming and things like that, even though they may not have the functional skills to have employment or go on to college. So we have set up this system that was flawed from the very beginning. So instead, I want you to think about this statement. I believe intelligence is not a single measurable characteristic. Now, one thing I will tell you in defense of our psychologists and the people that are responsible for that testing is that they are working within the flawed system that has been given to them. When they do a test and come up with that IQ score, it's because our state and our federal government has said that's what we have to do to prove that they need the services they need. So I don't want you going out and saying to your psychologist, that doesn't work for me. Well, that's good, it doesn't work, and let's start a conversation around that. But unfortunately, the system we work in right now, we have to do that testing. We have to show that the student needs that level of support. But we also, if you've been in special ed very long, know that that testing is up for interpretation. I can have one psychologist evaluate a student and the parents can go get another psychologist who's private and they can come up with totally different diagnoses. Well, that shows you how flawed that testing is. So we have to take it with a grain of salt and we have to get to know our students. So I'll give you a second to write down what are your thoughts about that intelligence is not a single measured characteristic. You can write that in your notes. So then what is the harm in believing that intelligence can be measured and unchanging? We think about that. If we think that we at 4 or 5 or 6 years old can measure a student's intelligence and we can determine how much they can and can't learn in the future, that really sometimes limits the opportunities given to that student. If I believe, oh, they'll never learn that math, so why should I work on it? We're just going to work on money and time because that's all they're going to need in life. They're never going to need all of that other stuff. Well, then I never give them the opportunity to learn. I do not presume they have the competence to learn. And so when we believe that one test can tell us the life potential of an individual, it can be very damaging. and can really change our perspective as educators and how we treat children and our expectations for them. And there are great quotes about expectations, like our greatest danger is not setting an expectation and not meeting the mark. It's that we set the expectation too low and we do meet that mark when we could have done so much more. So we just need to think about that and consider that when we are talking about our students and what they are capable of. Jen, I am so excited that you shared that you had a psychologist tell you couldn't go to college because of your disability. But you went part-time and got your associate's degree. I am so proud of you. That is awesome. One thing that comes out of this is I hope that you never hear from somebody else you can't do, but I hope we also, from our mouths, are never that voice that tells somebody else they can't. If we get nothing else out of this, it's to lift people up and not hold them down, because I truly believe that we're capable of most anything. Now, with that being said, I know I am not going to be an NBA star. I'm only 5'4", I'm pudgy, and it would not work. But I got to tell you that I could go out there and I could really practice and I could become good at basketball, that I might play at the YMCA with my friends for exercise. But thank you so much, Jen, for sharing that story. That's incredible. So you can write down your beliefs about this, about what you think of intelligence. So is there benefit from requiring students with significant disabilities to participate in the general ed curriculum? And, I'll be the first to tell you, in my 23 years, my thoughts on that question have probably changed drastically. And we'll talk about some other things about participating in the regular ed classroom, the general ed classroom, and I'll share some stories of my own experience as a special ed teacher. And I have that very motherly side of me that wanted to protect my babes. I didn't want them to go out there with people that would hurt them. So just think on your perspective right now, and do you think they can benefit from that general ed curriculum? So then this leads us to that flawed assumption number 2. There are people that truly believe that students who are judged to have significant sub-average intelligence cannot learn much from the general ed curriculum. So even if they could, why should we even bother? If we put them out there, they really can't learn. So why are we wasting their time? Anybody guilty of that thought? I'll be the first to tell you I probably was at times. I thought that my students needed much more than they could get there in that general ed classroom. But that was before I feel like I learned how much as a special educator I could have supported that general ed classroom. Because 99% of teachers out there are in education because they love kids and they're doing the right thing. Are we going to find people that aren't doing the right thing in any school building? Absolutely. But I probably, as myself, should have done more to support the general ed curriculum and the general ed teacher. And please know this is not in judgment of anybody listening. You are all doing an amazing job. And that's why I share with you my own perspectives and my own change of heart after the last 23 years. Yeah, and Brad shared that as a principal, he heard a lot from regular ed teachers. They were afraid they couldn't meet the needs of those students. And so I think as special ed teachers, it's not only our job to support our students, but to support those teachers as well. It's not that they don't want to support the students, it's that they're afraid they can't. And so the more we help teach them, I went and did a training in a district, and it was the regular ed teachers who were begging for co-teaching. It wasn't special ed teachers. And I was like blown away by that because my view had only ever been from special ed. So I always thought they're the people that don't want us, but they did. They really wanted that perspective and that growth because they wanted to support all kids. And so there really are fantastic teachers out there in general ed. And I would say start with them. Start with your positive voices who are going to lead the charge with you, and then expand it anytime you get a chance to be in a general education building. And if you're in a center and you think this doesn't apply to me, Well, it does, because we need to then get you access to general ed curriculum, and there's general ed standards, and connect with what is your local school building offering for curriculum. How do we get our hands on that so that we can support all of our students, no matter where they're located, in trying to reach the highest potential possible? So why do we do this? Why do we say a special ed student has to meet general ed curriculums? Well, it's the law. In IDEA 2004, and their Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015 required that all students make progress in general education curriculum. That's why we had before so many students who could take the PASA, and now all of a sudden we have students even in life skills classes taking the PSSA, because we're held to that accountability at some level that they at least have access to that general ed curriculum. So that turned it out that only 1% of our students are allowed to participate in that alternate assessment. If you think of 1%, that's our MDS kiddos, and that's it. Everyone else, autistic support, emotional support, life skills support, it should be taking the PSSA or Keystone exams, at least to the best of their ability. I know that is a frightening thing. I know it is, but we have to give them access to that material. The argument against participation, it's students that need to learn functional skills. You're absolutely right, but don't all students need to learn that? What point in the day do regular ed students learn to fill out a check in their checkbook? At what point in the day do general ed students learn social skills and those types of things? So my argument, while yes, our students need to know functional skills, do we teach that in a manner that is going to be the same they're going to encounter in the real world? I know as an emotional support teacher, I absolutely had to teach social skills. It was one of my requirements every year. My kids all had to participate in the class. I taught them social skills that I thought were appropriate for a work environment. I wanted them to have high standards for themselves. But I really didn't teach them how to hang out with friends, how to let their guard down and just be a teenager, and those types of things. And that's really hard as educators to teach that. So if they're never getting that experience with their same aged peers, how do they learn how those types of things? I worked with a student on a job site, and the other employees with her were cursing. We were in a back room, we were folding sheets, so we weren't around any customers, anything like that, and they were telling a story, and she corrected them, said, "You can't do that." All of a sudden, I'm like, oh my goodness, like I had to have a conversation with her that they can do that. They're adults, they're allowed to talk the way they want. If it offended her, she could say that I don't feel comfortable with that, but she couldn't tell them they couldn't do that because we weren't in a classroom and it was a different expectation. And so it's really difficult for us to teach social skills and functional skills the way these students are going to face those skills in the future. And so I want you to take that into consideration. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing to teach functional skills. Absolutely not, because it does take some of our students longer time to learn that. And we do want them to function in the world. But what is appropriate for us to teach? So just a thought, just to put that out there. And then consider what are our goals in education. Yeah, and Melissa put in here the idea of progress is a mindset shift. Believing better tomorrow than you were yesterday. And so, we're just looking at how can we improve what we're doing. Again, not an attack on anybody in any way, but I want to read you this one statement out of the book. The goal of an American education is to educate people to participate in democracy by understanding the lessons of history, the logic and magic of science and math, the joys of art and music, and the power of words to inspire and communicate. It is not equitable to deny those rights to a group of students who happen to have intellectual or developmental disabilities. So if you think about it, our American education system is designed to expose students to things and options that are out there. I was not great in algebra So that changed my mind about maybe being an architect or something like that. I absolutely love science. And then, I always knew I wanted to be an educator, but didn't really narrow down what area I wanted to go into. I love science and I loved biology class. I found that I was pretty good at writing and things like that. Well, I wouldn't have learned all of that if I had stayed in one special ed room with one teacher for several years. We need to expose them. We saw students shine who maybe struggled in writing, but they shined in art class or music class. In PE, where they just got to burn energy and be good at something during the day. And when we take those opportunities away from our students, we are limiting their ways to choose what they want to do for their future because they don't get exposed to anything. There was a quote at the beginning of a book. We did a summer session on your students, my students, our students. And we had Dr. Young, one of the authors here, to talk this summer. And the beginning quote in her book is from a student from an autistic support program. I have no idea where she's from, out in the Midwest. And his statement was, yeah, special ed's the class I go to do the things I'm bad at all day long. That hurt my heart because do we do that to kids? Do we drill and practice so much what they're bad at? And then we wonder why they disengage from school and why they don't want to come to school every day. We have to help them find their passions as well in education. And we can't do that sitting in one room. So it is so important that our kids be included. So I want you to consider this. I believe all students have different talents and skills as well as interests. And you can write in your note-taking form how you feel about that. And our kids do have skills. Again, tying back to transition, I had students go out on job sites that blew me away by what they could do in a job site. This one job site, they had to learn how to use this mechanical device. They only worked there on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the afternoon for 2 hours each time. And they had to use different codes and everything else. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, anybody else getting hired in that position worked 8 hours a day, Monday through Friday. They got to practice it over and over and over again. Our guys were only every other day. And then you had that whole break from Thursday to Tuesday. They learned it. They knew the codes better than I did as a job coach. And I'm thinking these kids were coming out of life skills classes where it was probably like, oh, they'll never learn that. And I'm not saying that of our teachers, but there are times we've all thought certain things about limits of our students. And here they were shining. They were doing better than me in the job. And we have to believe that our kids are capable and not give up on them and not let, again, that IQ score determine what they are given opportunity to do. So when we only focus on functional skills, what other equitable opportunities do our students miss out on? Just think about that for a minute. And you can write that in your note-taking sheet. So is there a benefit from including students with significant disabilities in a gen ed setting? We think about those things they could miss out on. What are the benefits of being in there? So flawed assumption number 3 then is that students who cannot learn much of the general ed curriculum, including those participating in alternate assessments, will not benefit from being in general ed classes. So if we think about that, not only are we talking about academic curriculum, but we're talking about some of those things I talked about before. Social skills. We're notorious for teaching students social skills. We teach them the rules of social behavior, but are we teaching them what it's like to be around their same aged peers? What's appropriate for texting? What's appropriate for being put online? And I do know some teachers cover that. The online environment that our kids are faced with now is so different than the way it was when I grew up. And it's very important that we teach them some of those social rules and what they can share and can't for safety purposes. It's also that exposure to areas of interest that can later become a passion. And we had many discussions in secondary transition with our students about what could be a hobby and what could lead to a career. We had a young lady who was very interested in the weather, and her dad asked, could she be a weather reporter on the news? And we had to sit down and explain to her and to dad that leads to college in meteorology, communication, those types of things. But because she loved weather didn't mean that couldn't be a hobby of hers in some way. It could lead to discussion and starting points when she's in a new social situation. And so we really dove in to explore ways that could still be helpful and still stay an interest to her, but it maybe wasn't necessarily an employment field for her. But you just never know. Finding ways like that can make pathways for students we weren't aware of. General ed students also learn from students with disabilities. It is so important for our general ed students to be exposed to people that are different from them. And I cannot reiterate that enough. We took students to a job site. It was at YMCA. They would come in and they would clean the equipment. And it was more just to get them out in the environment, see what's expected. That wasn't really what we hoped they would do for a career, but just to get them out there in the world. And then they could earn time working out and different things like that. There was a young lady there. These were high school age students. There was a young lady there working out who I think was home from college. She was about 18 or 19 years old. And one of the boys approached her. She got very scared and left and didn't say anything to anybody on the way out. Well, just so happens her parents knew somebody on the board of the YMCA, and she complained and we got kicked out. And I think if that 18 or 19-year-old girl had another 18 or 19-year-old boy walk up to her at her high school or at her college and she felt uncomfortable, what would she have done? She would have looked at it and said, back off or go away, or she would have went and talked to a friend. But because it was an individual with an obvious disability, it blew up into a situation that it didn't need to. She didn't treat him the way she would have treated any other person, same-aged peer, because most of our teenagers have not been exposed to people with disabilities. They are uncomfortable and they don't know how to handle it. And so it is just as imperative for our general ed students to have students with disabilities around them and near them and involved with them as it is the other way around. So we have those the ideas of equity and inclusion and acceptance, and we cannot create a culture of equity and inclusion and acceptance when we are in separate parts of the building or in separate classrooms or only see each other at lunchtime when our special ed table sits here all together. So we just need to think about those types of things. So instead, what if I believe that students learn best when they feel valued? When people hold high expectations for them and when they are taught and supported well? Well, would you feel valued if you went to the same room all day long in school and you saw everything else going on, but you weren't allowed to participate with them? Would you feel that high expectations were held for you when you are getting the message that maybe you can't do everything that other people can do? So I know you support your students. There is no doubt in my mind, you guys love your students, but we just need to be aware of, those expectations that we hold for them and make sure that we're holding very high expectations. So consider how segregating those students with disabilities limits all students. And I'll give you a minute to write notes. I wanted to show you a clip real quickly. This young man did a TED Talk, and he talked about how we are all different, and that is a wonderful thing. And his experience is coming from an adult friend that he has who has autism. So I'm starting it not from the very beginning because I don't want to take all of our time, but I just wanted to share his experience with you real quick.
Well, to be different. Today, I'm going to tell you about a friendship of mine that is a little different than you might expect. This is one of my best friends, Stephen. He is the happiest person I know. Stephen is 44 years old and has autism. Let me start by explaining how we became special friends. When my mom was just 13 years old, she was in the high school cafeteria about to have lunch with her friends. Then she passed a table of kids with special needs. Stephen was a boy at that table. He shouted out, "Hey, what's your name? Come sit with me." My mom sat down, and in that moment, a special friendship began. Stephen asked my mom 3 questions. He wanted to know what she was having for lunch, her phone number, and if they could be friends for 40 years. As my mom gave him her phone number and said yes, he clapped with excitement and said, "I will call you every day." Ever since that day, in 1988, he has kept his promise and called our house every single day. When I was born, Stephen was a special part of our family, and I've grown up calling him Uncle Stephen. Stephen is included in family dinners, he comes to my soccer games, he loves watching movies with us, and every couple of weeks he has a sleepover. Stephen has had autism his whole life. Autism spectrum disorder refers to a range of conditions characterized by challenges with social skills, repetitive behaviors, speech and nonverbal communications, as well as by unique strengths and differences. My friend Stephen is not able to drive a car, but he is able to memorize every phone number he has ever heard. There is no cure for autism, but I think Stephen is perfect the way he is. One of my favorite memories with Stephen is whenever a fire truck passes us. He shouts out when I grow up, "I want to be a fire truck." That always makes me smile. He likes the idea of being a fireman, but he loves the idea of being a fire truck. Another thing that always makes me laugh is how much he likes to eat. Have you ever met someone who can eat a steak, 8 slices of pizza, French fries, apple pie, ice cream, and they are still starving? Well, Stephen eats all that almost every time we see him. Finally, one of my favorite memories with Stephen is when we play hide and seek. He always hides in the closets. I love playing hide and seek with Stephen. It always makes me smile. But not just me. He makes everyone smile. I don't think we need a cure for autism, just like we don't need a cure for freckles. Autism is not a disease, just like brown hair isn't a disease. You don't need to fix something that isn't broken. I look up to my Uncle Stephen as he is the happiest person I know. Stephen doesn't try to be like anyone else. He is exactly who he was meant to be. Imagine a world where we all live like Stephen. Find out what makes you different. Don't be afraid to stand out. Wake up, jump out of bed, and be exactly who you are. We are all a little different, and that's awesome. Thank you.
I love that video. That just is so sweet. And I think of how this young man's mother's life changed the day she met Stephen, and then how this young man's life is changed growing up, in that he is exposed to someone who is different, and it makes him different himself. He starts the video talking about how he wears different socks and people have made fun of him, but he's okay with who he is because he's so proud of being different. And I think that if we come at education with that philosophy, that differences shouldn't be difficulties, they should be celebrated, I think we would really change our perspective on how we teach and educate students. And I know that mindset shift is not an easy shift to make, because we want to do the very best that we can, and we don't see necessarily always the same level of progress in students that struggle. But progress is progress, and we need to celebrate that the way it looks for whomever it is. Yeah, Melissa, I love that. Differences are celebrated. And you will have all these videos and links, so if you want to share them, please do. But yeah, differences should be normalized. How boring is our world if we all fit the same? And our education system has been set up to normalize people to fit into a work society from the Industrial Revolution. You know, I wanted to create an education factory workers who could all come in and do the same thing. But these generations that we're raising now will face careers that haven't been developed. They will be challenged to solve problems that we haven't even thought of yet. And I think one thing, again, that I know through transition, there are companies that are going out there and actively recruiting individuals on the autism spectrum because their mind works differently and because they think so outside of the box from what a normal, I wouldn't say normal, but what they call it, neurotypical individual thinks, that it's really helping them see things differently and create different business models and different perspectives. So what are your thoughts on this? I'm sorry, that this moves us into the next topic. So any other thoughts about that video, or anybody want to share anything? So moving into that next topic, this is talking about communication, and this is our last of the 4 assumptions. Is there a connection between a student's ability to communicate and their ability to learn? Go ahead and write that down, your thoughts right now on that statement. You're absolutely right, Jen. If you believe what they told you, you wouldn't be where you are now. And we're so happy that you're here with us. That's awesome. So our flawed assumption number 4 is that when students cannot effectively communicate, assumptions are made about what they currently know and what they might be able to learn. And we're going to talk about how this assumption maybe doesn't reflect as much on the student, but maybe the people who are working with the student. Because my failure to communicate with that student says a lot about me. I should be working with that. At what age do we start to communicate? From birth. A baby communicates that they're hungry or they're uncomfortable, they're too hot, their diaper is soiled, they cry, and we have to figure it out. But that baby, from the moment they enter this world, is communicating. So we need to know how our students are communicating with us and learn communication systems with them. But it's not necessarily a failure on their part. If we can't figure it out, we need to keep working at it. So let's delve into communication. There are a lot of false assumptions made about an individual's ability to speak in relation to their level of intelligence. There is a fantastic movie that came out, I think in the 70s or 80s, starring Daniel Day-Lewis. It's called My Left Foot. It's the story of a gentleman, Christy Brown, who was in Ireland, I believe, and he was born with cerebral palsy and could not speak. They didn't realize how intelligent he was and how much he was taking everything in. He learned to pick up a pencil and write with his foot because he had so little communication. He couldn't control what he's speaking and he couldn't control his arms or hands, but he learned to write with his feet. And so they found out that he could learn, and he was picking up all this stuff on his own without even attending school, back at a time when an individual like that could have ended up in an institution or something like that. So it's an amazing movie if you get a chance to see it. Assessing a child with no reliable means of communication will automatically reflect a lower ability. We have to know that. If we give a student who speaks Spanish an assessment in English, of course they're going to score lower. If we get a student who can't read a written assessment, of course, they haven't been taught how to read yet. So we need to make sure that the assessment fits how that student communicates, or we're just perpetuating that assumption that they can't learn. And then also consider the environment where a child can best learn the communication skills, where they feel safe. And we have to build that community with them. And we have to really get to know an individual that struggles with communication so that we can learn their communication method. Once we learn that, we can teach them other methods that may be more appropriate for other people. But until we learn how they're communicating with us, it's difficult to teach that. I love that, Jen. The Fred Rogers movie, I watched that too. Mr. Rogers, that's another fantastic movie if you get to see it. He believed in everybody, and man, There are days where I really want to be him, and I try really hard because he believed that anybody was capable of just about anything. So we're working on that environment. We also need to remember that we normally understand way more than we can say. You know, you sit in a discussion about, let's say I was sitting in a room full of tech people, because I am not extremely techy. You'll see I was moving things all over, and so I'm learning a lot. But if I sit in a room where somebody's having a conversation around technology, I feel like sometimes they're totally speaking a different language I don't understand. And so if they asked me a question, I may be able to give them an or I may be able to spit something back that I thought I knew, but I'm not going to sound very intelligent. But I could pick up pieces of it, I bet. And then I would go to somebody else that I felt comfortable with, and I'd be like, what is this? You know, and I would, so a lot of times we pick things up, but we may not be able to translate it into language ourselves or explain it. And what is the only prerequisite skill relevant to communication? Breathing. That is the only thing we need to do to be able to communicate, like we said with babies. Core words that we teach students can fit any situation, and then fringe words are situational. And if you work with students who have communication boards, I want you to think about what's on their communication board. Do you have words that are very situational and academic, or whatever you're working on? Or do you also try to have those core words in there for them that they can just express how they're feeling, or that they need to go to the bathroom, or that they're hungry, or those types of things too, because communication boards really limit what a student is able to tell us. And I know that a lot of that comes from, we have to teach them more and more and more to fit more on that communication board. But that really is, and teaching students safety signs, absolutely, so that they know those things. So we have to consider what we're teaching for communication and what we're giving students access to telling us, to make sure that we are keeping them safe, but we're also giving them that chance to be as normal in communication as possible. And also don't forget that behavior is a communication. When students lash out, it's because they can't tell us that they're frustrated or they're upset or they don't understand something. So again, behavior is also a communication. And we have to set that expectation that all students will and can communicate. And that communication should be one of the key things we are teaching students. If they can't communicate, think about their world, and think about how that limits them from participating in the world. Think about how unsafe their world is because they can't tell somebody that, you know, that they're in an unsafe situation. They can't get help when they need it. And so communication is the key to everything. So our belief statement should be that when students cannot currently communicate they're smart, for whatever that means for them, we presume that they are, and we develop their educational program based on that assumption. So I don't want to look at a student who can't communicate and assume that they have also an intellectual disability or anything like that. I want to assume that they're hearing everything I say, that they're learning from it, and they're picking up on it, that they understand. Have you ever seen situations where somebody's like in a coma and people in the room talking about them? How do we know they're not getting information and hearing that? So they need to hear positive messages that we believe in them and that they can learn. So think about that for a second. Consider a world in which you could not communicate your basic needs and wants. In what ways would your life be limited? And this can happen. Tomorrow, unfortunately, we could leave here and be in a car accident and lose our ability to communicate. And what would that mean for you and your family? We have to think. I mean, it's very difficult. And one other thing, going back to that, you reminded me, thank you, is going back to that idea of communication is there is another great video. Did I watch a lot of videos or what? But there is another great video we learned at the PDE conference last year, or the year before. There is a gentleman who directs films, Dan Habib, Habib. He has done documentary films about disability. It started with his son, Samuel, who was born with a disability that severely affected his communication and his ability to learn. And his first documentary was including Samuel, and it kind of follows their journey as parents, their child's journey with inclusion. And it is very powerful. And he's done a lot of videos that now that I've experienced in different avenues. He also did one including Kelsey, or Who Cares About Kelsey, which was a child with significant behavior problems. And it's used through our Renew training. And one powerful video that they shared with us was, it's called, Mr. I got to think of the name and I got to think of it. It's their son Samuel's principal, and he ended up getting ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And with Lou Gehrig's disease, your body starts to break down and you lose muscle control, but your brain never deteriorates. It's your brain's connections with your muscles. And it was, it's actually shared at the end, so you get the name of the video. But he lost his ability to communicate. And this was a principal who was a very strong advocate for inclusion his whole life. He was one of those principals that knew every kid in the building. He stood outside every day talking to them, coming in. He made home visits. Incredible, incredible guy. And he got ALS. And through his journey with ALS, he never stopped working until he absolutely had to. But he did a very powerful thing in that he allowed every single student in his middle school building to ask him a question. And he had to use a communication device and answer the questions. And they asked him everything. Was he afraid to die? Was he, how did it feel not to be able to talk anymore? What did he miss most? You know, he played guitar, so they asked him where he learned to play guitar. But it was very powerful to see somebody who could communicate lose their communication. And what he learned from that towards the end of his life was such a powerful message, in that, you know, we all kind of need to know that and understand that. And it really helped him. Thank God he was an advocate for inclusion before that. But it's very powerful short video that, again, is shared here at the end of this. A definition for presumed competence is: in the absence of conclusive data, educational decisions ought to be based on assumptions which, if incorrect, would have the least dangerous effect on the likelihood that students will be able to function independently as adults. So if we think about that, well, what is our conclusive data to show that somebody can't learn? We've already said that IQ scores really are not an accurate measure. So don't we have to assume that all students can learn and create educational plans that says they all can learn? Because if we assume that somebody can't learn, we automatically, in who we are in our human nature, limit what we expose those students to. I mean, come on, we don't want them to experience failure, do we? So we protect them and we limit what we give them. And so there is this idea that that we have to be careful of how we limit our students. Just making sure I'm watching my time here. I get a little passionate about this subject. So instructional strategies, we're going to dig into this very quickly. It's just going to be surface instructional strategies because we're running low. We only have about 15 minutes of time, and I do want to give you time to do your evaluation at the end. Ann Donnellan then also went on to state that we should assume that poor performance is due to instructional inadequacy rather than student deficits. I don't know about you, but that's almost like a stab to my heart. Because I know I worked really hard as a teacher, and I still had students that maybe struggled and didn't get to the level I wanted them to. What I think she's trying to say through this is, if a student doesn't succeed, don't let it be because you haven't put everything out there on the table. Don't let it be because you limited their access to something. Let it be that I've provided everything I know how to provide, and this student is still struggling, so now I'm going to the next person to help and the next person to help. Don't let a disability label decide what we give to students and how much we allow them to learn. Just be careful that we're doing all that we can instructionally to provide for students. And honestly, students are still going to fail in some ways. We can't take that necessarily personally, but we need to understand that we're providing all that we can. So we don't really have time for this, but if we had the topics here, how could we promote independence for these types of things? I'm going to skip this discussion just on the interest of time, but think about how you can promote independence in communication. And I don't just mean independence talking between you and that student. I mean, how do they communicate with peers? How do they communicate with somebody who doesn't understand their communication system? I had a student who worked at a Goodwill store who was deaf. They had to wear name tags, and the policy at Goodwill is if a customer comes up to you and asks a question, you have to answer it, or you have to take them to the next person. He, being super self-advocate, said, I won't be able to hear them. What can I do? And we talked about different things. He said, I just want to write on my name tag, I'm deaf. I want people to see that so they know that I want to help them. But they can come up to me and I can lead them to somebody else, but it doesn't look like I'm being rude and not answering them. And I was so proud of him that he came up with that all on his own. He shared with somebody, I'm not afraid of my disability. This is who I am. How do we promote independence in academics? How do we build problem solving in that students can solve things on their own and ask for help when they need it? We don't set them up to be dependent on our help. How do we set into times to be independent in participation in school, activities, clubs, music, band, art, whatever that is? How do we set up independence in behavior, maybe self-checklists, and then also in those social interactions? I want kids invited for sleepovers and things like that, so that they have the same opportunities to be a part of their community as anybody else. All right, essentializing content. I am so sorry that we're only going to get to a little bit of this, but begin with that grade level standard. I'm going to give you resources for this. You would design a learning target and then essentialize that process, and then design instruction to build the skills towards mastery of those targets. And I will tie this back into that this is really ties into the Project Max, or they now call it LIU Max. And I'm going to give you contact. So if any of this that we've talked about today has sparked interest in wanting to get deeper into those academics, please reach out to them and find out when they're doing that training next year. I also help with that training, but it is fabulous. And I have not seen one single person go through that training who has not come out on the other side of it going, oh my gosh, I cannot believe the work that my students are doing now, that I never believed they could do, or I am just so impressed. So please reach out to them. So we would code a standard to reduce the complexity, isolating what the student needs to know, and then examining those pieces in relation to what they currently can do. We would circle what they need to know, box in what they need to do, and then underline the context of it. So I'm going to give you two quick examples here. A grade 7 math is they're going to use percentages to solve real world math problems. What do they need to do? Or what do they need to know? Percentages. And what do they need to do? How to solve. And then in what context? Real world math problems. So we might be using problems at a store where there's a 10% discount or something like that. A grade 3 ELA standard, identify characters and what they do during events in a story. So what do we need to know? The characters and what they do. What do we have to do? We have to identify them. And then this is during events in the story. I put in patent.net and I gave you directions to find more of this alternate eligible content and the essentialization examples. They have amazing examples in there for all the standards at all the grade levels. And they give you, if I'm looking at that ELA standard, they give me a low, medium, and high way to break that standard down. So guess what? The work is done for you. You don't have to do it. So please make sure you take this slide and dig into that a little bit. So our reasons to resume competence, our expectations matter. Kids read us like a book. They know when a teacher believes in them and when they don't. They know when you are just saying something out your mouth that isn't matching your heart and your head. That's their survival mechanism. They know what you expect of them and if you believe in them or not. Traditional assessments of people with disabilities are seriously flawed. And even the people who wrote those assessments said, this is not what you should be using it for. Research shows that individuals with intellectual disabilities have shown they are competent. And if they are given the means to communicate, the opportunity to learn in a way that fits their learning style, and the right instructional and technology supports, they are capable of learning so much, especially if it's an area of interest for them, like any of us. Number 4, to presume incompetence could result in harm to a student. Anytime I remove them from a situation because I am afraid they can't do it, I have removed them from experience in their life. That may have been their next passion. That may have been the thing that sparked them to want to grow and learn. I think often of my ES students and how they often, because their behavior did not get experience, didn't get opportunities to go into classes that would have been maybe the key that would have triggered them to want to do better. But, you know, it's hard to know. And even if educators are wrong about a student's capacity to learn, the consequences of that incorrect assumption are not as dangerous as if we kept them from the opportunity. So I'd rather be wrong and give them every opportunity I had and they couldn't pick up on the material than taking opportunity away from them. So resources, like I said, most everything in this training is from this book by Cheryl Jurgensen. I love this book. It's great for administrators to know how to include students, but also it's just for us and our mindset about inclusion. More training availability. There is the essentialization process. Patton has a lot of wonderful webinars on that. Again, the LIU Max training, I cannot tell you enough how much I love that training. So reach out to Patty and or Kelly. I know they're supervisors. I know it's a little intimidating, but they are very down to earth and wonderful people. And they are super excited about getting a group of people together next year for that training. And then also our AT trainer, Val Lil, now Valerie Chapman Jones, she got married. Amazing. If you have not attended any of her AT trainings, I cannot tell you enough how awesome her trainings are and how the right AT, the right technology can really open doors for students. And that's even students who you maybe think don't have communication problems, but maybe need better access to academics. You know, leveling reading so that they still have access. You know, students can read Macbeth or something like that. There's ways to level that text so they don't need to be removed from that English class. They can read it on a level they can understand, and then they can still be a part of the discussion in that class and learn at any level with the right help. And then videos. These are the videos. Mr. Connolly has ALS was that video that just left my head. Amazing video. Shelley Moore is extremely funny. She has a great video on presuming competence called Under the Table. She's a Canadian educator who's worked with students with very complex support needs. Todd Rose and the Myth of Average. If you haven't seen that, fantastic, because he talks about how none of us is average. Not a single one of us is average. We are all uniquely wonderful. And then the movie My Left Foot with Daniel Day-Lewis. So that is all I had for you. We have about 5 minutes. I kind of ran you right to the last minute. Our attendance, make sure you write down that session code, the 3319. You don't do attendance until the very end of the day, but make sure you have that code written down so you know it. The evaluation link, I don't know, Melissa, can you put that in the chat, the evaluation link, so that it's easier for everybody if they don't have this PowerPoint open? You should go in and do that right away. It'll be quicker. It's a very short feedback form, lets me know what I did right and wrong, and helps me to better this presentation for the future. So I appreciate honest feedback. And I thank you so much for spending your session with me right after lunch. I know it's a long day of Zooming, so I really appreciate the time tuning in. It's been wonderful. And, you know, my email will also be in this. You saw it at the very beginning. So when you download the handouts and you want to continue this conversation, I am very happy to continue that with you. Thank you so much.